Thank you all so much for joining us here this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. We will give it a minute or two for folks to trickle in and probably start in about 1 minute. But thank you all for joining us here. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all again for joining today for our discussion, Mental Health in College, What Research Tells Us About Supporting Students. My name is Bryan Ashton. I serve as Chief Strategy and Growth Officer for Trellis, head of our Trellis Strategies team. We are a nonprofit research organization that focuses on what we call the modern learner. One of the things that we've been really focused on over the last few years is the role that mental health plays in student success. And so we couldn't be happier than to host this conversation here today and really excited to bring this group of esteemed colleagues together. I will be turning it over here to Dr. Alexis Redding to help us frame the conversation. But this really is a conversation that's rooted in some a new publication that came out yesterday, actually, I believe. So we are, I think, the first real conversation after the book was released that was edited by Dr. Alexis Redding and focuses on this new kind of conversation about what research is telling us to support students as we navigate the mental health landscape that our students face today. We are really excited to have a group of authors here from the book, and also to have Adrian Gonzales, who has helped to really launch some great initiatives on campus and be really a focal point of great student support work that is occurring on the ground. And so, with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Alexis Redding to help us to frame the conversation and the edition that came out yesterday. We will put the book link in the chat and also send it out as a part of our follow up. And this will also be recorded and sent out to you after the session as well. So thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Alexis, for all of the work that went into this great publication.
Well, thank you, Bryan. It is exciting. It launched yesterday, which means we are holding the book in our hands for the first time. Seeing it in print after, and I looked back in my emails just yesterday to see how long this journey had been. It's almost 2.5 years from that original germ of an idea, turning what I was doing in a professional development course that I'm teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and making those messages broadly accessible to everyone, which is exciting. It's real, it's here, and this is the first conversation that we are able to be in with members of the community that brought this book to life. This is a labor of love for 20 of us who have been working together for these 2.5 years. There are 14 authors, scholars, researchers, medical doctors, journalists, social workers, student affairs professionals, all in the kind of conversation that we don't often have with one another. One of the ideas behind the book was to bring a bunch of people together who are often attending different conferences, writing in different publications, reading different publications, but to have a conversation where all of us were talking together about this topic that we care so deeply about. In addition to those 14 authors, and I left out the most important, we also have student authors, and you'll hear a little bit about the 3 students who shared their story, their journey in such a profound and personal way to make sure we were grounding what we were doing in the voices of students. We also have 5 practitioners that I got to interview and write about the work that they are doing, some on college campuses, but others around college campuses. A social worker who is working individually with students, someone who ran the Stress Busters program for many years, thinking about how we can create a peer-to-peer program of support. And so it's exciting to be here together. 6 of the 20 folks who came together to write this book are going to be part of this conversation. So I'll tell you just in framing what it is they'll share about their individual chapters or vignettes, the 3 goals that we have for this book: to have a different kind of conversation about mental health in college. The first one is the profound work of the Trellis Group, which is talking about modern learners. The vast majority of the literature talking about student experiences with mental health are focused on residential college students who are full-time students who are 18 to 25 years old, who have very few other obligations and commitments outside of being a student. And what we know from practice and what we know from the Trellis research is that is not the default mode of being a college student today. And so if we are going to have a conversation about supporting students, we need to understand the complexity and the nuance of their lives and how they are navigating the spaces that they are in, which is sometimes a college campus, sometimes a commuter school, a community college, or attending online. And we have to think about all of those spaces as we're crafting our practice. The second thing is that we are thinking in a different way about the student journey. So the book is called Mental Health in College, which would assume that we're talking about just the time a student is matriculated, enrolled in an institution. Actually, we start the conversation early and we end it late. We begin this story of the student journey with college admissions, because that frames the story of college, the expectations, some of the stress and pressures that students are feeling on the way in. The CEO of the National Association of College Admissions Counseling co-authored a chapter on the stresses of admissions based on what they were hearing from college counselors in and around schools across the country, to begin to think about how we support students before they even get to us. And then we have a chapter about what happens in the transition to the workforce. So much of our conversation about what's happening in college is about return on investment, what's happening in the job market. Are students going to be able to find placement? That stress permeates everything we do in a higher education institution. And so we stop our conversation there as students are transitioning out and into the next chapter. And we have Dustin Liu and Joe Catrino. Dustin is from NYU, Joe Catrino is from Dartmouth, and both of them came together at Stanford through the Life Design Lab, thinking about frameworks of profound exploration and supporting students in the journey. So that's the second thing we're hoping to do in a very different way. And then the third, this comes from my chapter, so this one is near and dear to my heart. It is a reframing of the conversation about the crisis of mental health in college. Here's what I know from my research, and I've been studying the college experience for 80 years. I am not quite that old. I have been studying the experience of college students across 80 years. I use archival materials going all the way back to the 1940s, interviews with students talking about the complexities of their journeys, talking about loneliness, talking about the struggle to find connection and community, talking about non-clinical anxiety, the pressure of the job market, trying to ask and answer those big developmental questions. Who am I? What do I want out of my life? How am I going to get there? And who do I want with me on the journey? And what I have seen in that research that both relies on archival materials and contemporary interviews with students around the country today is that there are two things going on when we're talking about mental health in college. One, there are students who have clinical concerns who need to find their way to a clinical counseling center with the trained, compassionate professionals who can help them when they have a challenge that they need that support. But at the same time, the broad group of students on college campuses does not meet the threshold for a clinical diagnosis. What they are having are very real, very typical, and very expected challenges around loneliness, around non-clinical anxiety, around the stress of what am I going to do with my life. These are expected things that happen in moments of transition. And so what we're trying to do is reframe the conversation so that we never miss a student who is having a clinical struggle, so that we get them the support that they need. We never want to underreact. But at the same time, we don't want to overreact to a student who is having a typical struggle. Because if a student comes into my office and they say, I'm really having a hard time, I'm depressed, I might hear the word depressed and think, okay, I need to immediately refer them to the campus mental health center. What's better is if I stop and I ask a couple of directed questions. What does that mean to you? How does that show up in your life? How long has this been going on? I don't need clinical training to open the threshold of that conversation and just figure out, are they having a bad day because they got a bad grade? They had a fight with their partner? Are they having a bad day because something more profound is going on? And by taking that extra minute to have that conversation, we can figure out who needs a referral and who doesn't. And the reason why we want to do that is because if my automatic response to that student is to refer them and send them to the counseling center, I've shut down a line of communication. I have missed an opportunity to scaffold what's going on and to introduce them to other resources. And if it was really just a bad grade or a bad day, I have now pathologized that moment and panicked them. And so by having a more humane conversation about what we can expect of the struggle, it not only helps us meet that student where they are, but it helps us to identify the student who's having a clinical concern so that we make sure they get to the other side of the help that they need with the professionals who do that work. So it is exciting to me to have launched this book and to be able to tell a very different kind of story about how we support students, how we make sure we don't miss what's going on, and how we really uplift the student stories in the process. And I think the first person you're going to hear from is Rainesford Stauffer, who's a wonderful collaborator and has been for many years now. We've had an opportunity to work together in different spaces. Her chapter is the very first one in the book. It was not originally the first chapter in the book. It was like chapter 7. But then I got the chapter and it centers student voices and lived experiences. And we decided that's exactly where the conversation needs to begin. And so it is up first. I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to Rainesford.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be with you. So glad to have gotten to contribute to a book like this. And perhaps most importantly, so glad to get to be here to talk a little bit about what students shared in this chapter, which is one of my favorite parts of my own work as a writer and reporter, and one of the things that I am consistently impressed by, fascinated by, and believe we need more of in all conversations about student life, student experiences, and well-being. As Dr. Redding mentioned, my chapter is focused on the student experience. I've covered young adulthood and student experiences of different ages as a writer and reporter. I did so in my first book, An Ordinary Age, that focused on the extraordinary expectations placed on young adults and what it means to come of age when everything important and meaningful in your life is supposed to be happening all at the same time, and what that transition feels like. I've reported series on parenting students and how they're accessing four-year education, the resources, the support, the community that they have helped create to thrive on their campuses and outside them. I've always been interested in student stories because I find education and pursuing one's education to be a really important point of transition. It's where you're discovering new parts of yourself, you're stepping into new interests, you might be in new spaces or having new conversations. And so as a writer and a reporter who had a quote unquote non-traditional college experience myself, which feels like it happened a million years ago, I've always been focused on how can we add complexity to who we think of as a college student? How can we capture the nuances of what the college experience really is and not just kind of the popular stereotype of what it ought to be? I found over the course of my reporting that that stereotype, in addition to leaving a lot of people and a lot of really meaningful stories and experiences out, has sometimes led to students feel like they're falling short if they're not having that idealized of the best 4 years of their life that happens in one consecutive order with one consistent major and kind of this streamlined, idealized version of what it means to be a student. So that was kind of the background that I brought to this chapter. That's where I was interested in going with it. And the more I was digging into reporting on what it means to be a student right now, I found that the most important thing I could do with a space like this is step out of the way just a little bit and create some space, hopefully, for student voices to be front and center. So my chapter sort of consists of a couple different parts. In our introduction, we kind of set the stage for what does student mental health feel like right now from the student perspective? Our social, political, and economic climate shape both day-to-day pressures as well as long-term ones, including what it means to imagine a future amid a lot of uncertainty. And I think that that is so much the work of education, imagining who you want to be in the world, how you want to show up, and developing the skills that you need in order to do that. We know that legislative attacks on LGBTQ people are persisting. We know that students on campuses have been under attack for exercising rights to free speech and protest or being targeted because of their identities. We know that there are ongoing concerns about breaking into the labor market. We know that students are often parents or caregivers themselves. And I say all of this because all of those things, just as they do for all of us, impact well-being. They impact how we make our way through our day-to-day, including through our work and through our educations. So for my part of this chapter, I spoke with students about what all of those factors look like and how they kind of coincide with this pressure to achieve and make the most of one's college journey. That included basic needs insecurity, the importance of belonging and seeing your identity and your life experience represented in the spaces that you're in higher education. It included the pressure of commuting or leaving school and deciding to go back to finish your degree and what that felt like. So one of the things that kind of ran throughout these conversations was the importance of having students as collaborators when we talk about mental health. And the second part of the chapter tries to put that into practice. I was lucky enough to be joined by three incredible co-authors, Lauren, Mira, and Isha, who each wrote an essay about their own college experience and their own experience with mental health. They are on three completely different kinds of campuses. They are still current college students today, and they spoke about things like how holistic support are overlooked keys to improving student well-being, what it felt like to be an exemplary high school student who burned out in college and didn't know how to seek out resources for support. They spoke about college being a space where they finally felt like they had freedom to fail and freedom to discover. My favorite thing about those essays, and I think what makes them so important within this conversation, is it's three completely different experiences, and still it does not capture everything we could talk about when we talk about the student experience with mental health. So our hope in this chapter, and I think I can speak for my three student co-authors here a little bit, is that it's just one snapshot of centering student voices and what that can look like and how it can feel. It's not the whole picture because it can't be and it shouldn't be. I do hope that it's an invitation for us to continue those conversations and to make sure that students are centered in them.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for centering the student voice really as we start these conversations. Next, we were fortunate to kind of be able to draft a chapter that focused on student mental health and student finances. And so I'll turn it over to Allyson Cornett from Trellis Strategies.
Thanks, Bryan. Hi, everyone. My name is Allyson, and I'm the Director of Research here at Trellis Strategies and a co-author of one of the chapters in the book, which is Reconsidering the Cost of College, Financial Pressure, Competing Demands, and Student Mental Health. And to get started, I think, here at Trellis, we really began focusing much more intentionally on student mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw issues like loneliness and, honestly, I think psychological distress just became a lot more visible in the student experience. And what we observed during that period really helped shape our understanding of how closely mental health is tied to students' financial pressures and competing demands. And I think it kind of makes sense to start our conversation by quickly grounding us in the primary data source that we're using for this chapter, which was our Student Financial Wellness Survey, or SFWS. The Student Financial Wellness Survey is a no-cost, web-based survey that was developed by Trellis Strategies to document college students' financial well-being, mental health, basic needs, and other indicators of student success. So we first administered the survey in 2018, and since then we have surveyed more than 4.3 million students across 341 institutions in 37 states. So this chapter specifically draws on data from our fall 2023 administration of the SFWS, which included responses from over 62,000 students across 142 institutions. And these institutions spanned public two-year colleges, public four-year universities, and also private not-for-profit institutions, giving us a really fortunate and broad view of today's students across the post-secondary landscape. So one of the strengths of the Student Financial Wellness Survey is its ability to examine students' experiences holistically. The survey integrates validated mental health screening tools, including the PHQ-2 for depression and the GAD-2 for anxiety, alongside measures of food insecurity, housing insecurity, financial fragility, and then also student employment. So this really allows us to analyze how finances, basic needs, mental health, and academics are intersecting rather than treating these issues as separate or independent of each other. And then the survey, we've really geared it to understanding the reality of today's students, with many modern learners balancing work, caregiving, and other non-academic responsibilities alongside their college enrollment. So with that kind of survey context in mind, I want to turn now to the conceptual intersection of finances and mental health. That's kind of the basis for our chapter. So we know that the cost of college, right, has increased over time, not only through tuition and fees, but also through indirect costs, such as housing, food, transportation, and childcare. And for many of these students, these indirect costs now make up the majority of their total cost of attendance. At the same time, we also know that financial aid has not been able to keep pace with these rising expenses, leaving many students in this kind of ongoing precarious stage of financial fragility and uncertainty while they're also managing college life. We also know that this financial stress does not operate in isolation. It interacts with students' multiple roles as workers, parents, and caregivers, and often this contributes to their sense of time poverty and chronic stress. And our wellness data really do show that the financial strain and mental health of these students are deeply intertwined. Our data suggests that students experiencing financial hardship are more likely to experience or report difficulty concentrating, sleep disruptions, symptoms of anxiety, and indicators of major depressive disorder. And I think these relationships are most clearly visible when we're looking at overall basic needs and security. So I'm going to have a little bit of percentages here that I want to throw out. So while we know 58% of students overall in the survey experienced at least one form of basic needs insecurity back in fall of 2023, we saw that number rise really sharply among students who had positive screens for mental health concerns. So we saw more than 70% of students with a positive anxiety screen and nearly 3/4 of students with positive depression screens had experienced at least one form of basic needs insecurity in that same time window. And this elevated level of basic needs insecurity really reflects what I like to call like cumulative instability rather than a single hardship. We also saw that food and housing insecurity, as well as homelessness, were consistently more common among students who had those positive anxiety or depression screens through those kind of two short form screeners. And for these students, we know that the stress of meeting daily survival needs directly competes with their academic demands and their emotional and mental well-being. These mental health challenges can also feed back into financial instability by disrupting their academic progress, increasing the risk of them maybe losing their aid, and then that kind of prolongs their time to degree, creating this really unfortunate reinforcing cycle of stress and instability for these students. So with the survey overview and the conceptual framework that we kind of worked with, now that I've covered those, I'm going to kick it over to Bryan to cover some of the key findings and implications for institutions that we were able to feature in the chapter.
Yeah, so we were able to take a look at how do we help campuses to operationalize some of the data that we were able to pull together through the Student Financial Wellness Survey. A few things that we elevated as a part of that conversation. The first was to think about how do we use the data that we are collecting through regular means to drive our strategies on financial well-being and mental health. And so we have different ways to collect some of that data. We have unmet need data and financial aid data that we can look at. We also have our counseling center intake forms and other sort of data sources where we can add questions about financial stress and thinking through how individuals are experiencing financial challenges. And there's good clinical reasons for this too, right? A lot of medications that are prescribed require the ability to be able to eat, for example, on the medication. And so as we think about the clinical components, we're able to then connect students to broader public benefits and resources like on-campus food pantries and other components. If we know that they're suffering financial hardship or if they have, food insecurity or other kind of flags that we may see as they're coming in for clinical support. We also are really hoping that campuses will honor sort of these students' multiple identities and think through their policies and practices to address things like time poverty that Allyson mentioned, that oftentimes financial trade-offs are made in part because of limited financial resources, but also because of time constraints and limited time. And so as we think about how we kind of make our policy and procedure infrastructure evolve for the modern learner, doing so in a way that can help to support and reduce some of those time barriers is incredibly important. The third thing that we talked a lot about is this idea of recognizing that financial support is a mental health support. And the more that we can do to close some of these unmet need gaps and day-to-day financial stressors and anxiety points that students are experiencing, we also hope to then see kind of impacts on student mental health as a part of that. We think that the data supports those conversations being connected as opposed to sort of siloed conversations on campus. And then finally, basic needs support is a huge part of this for our students. And so whether it's connecting students to public benefits that they're eligible for, thinking through childcare access, developing emergency aid programs, all of these are not just things that are helping students to stay enrolled from a financial perspective, but they're also helping to ease some of the stress and anxiety points that we see in our students' lives as well. And so really advocating for kind of the threading of some of these conversations of financial success and mental health as being key drivers of student success. So with that, I will turn it over to Adam to walk through the next chapter that we're highlighting here today.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam, and I wrote the chapter on meeting the mental health needs of student veterans. And as I was thinking about the talk today and being here, what's really been at the forefront of my mind is that talking about the military and the military's relationship with higher education is so complicated by our current moment. And when I say current moment, I mean right now, today, this week, this month. As this relationship between the military and higher education has been complicated by so many moments in history. And our student veterans, I know, really feel that, both in the weight of the now, but also in the weight of the history they're carrying. So when I first started writing this chapter, I was actually still in the military and I was back in grad school. So it was one of those unique moments in life where I'm both studying a population that I'm definitively a part of. And at the time I was writing this chapter, the big narrative I was seeing in my practice with the active duty military was reeling from the moral injury of the pullout of Afghanistan. Yet a lot of the data I was using, a lot of the literature that was available was still based when we were actively involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. So there was this active translation while writing of where the data was and where we are now. And of course, between writing the chapter and the book coming out, we're in a different moment for our student veterans and our military affiliated students. And I think that's one of the key things to consider when we talk about mental health, is that we're encountering these military affiliated students at these different moments. And if we use like the chronosystem idea, where they are in time. For instance, if a student while they're in school is in the reserves, they may be wondering, will I be deployed to what the US is doing now internationally? If they're in the Guard, will I be deployed back to my home community? All of which I think is vital to consider when meeting the mental health needs of student veterans. Now, when we talk about student veterans, and I've probably already used terms already that are so loaded with idiosyncratic meaning. And when we talk about meeting mental health needs, the thing I consider is actually making sure that we define what is a veteran, what's in that identity, and what comes with that identity on specific campuses in distinct regions of the United States. Because a veteran experience, it's not singular. There's this key phrase I picked up from Travis Martin's book, War and Homecoming. And it's, if you know one veteran, you know one veteran. And that speaks not only to the diversity of the experience, but also the diversity of the individual, acknowledging that the veteran identity is just this one part of this very complicated, multifaceted identity. So there's this unifying occupational identity, the identity of veteran, but that occupational identity of veteran is in itself very complicated. The identity of veteran is more central to some than it is to others. And I also think, drawing on the reconceptualized model of multidimensional identity, that veteran identity also shifts in its importance for people depending on what environment they're in. I know I can speak personally that my own veteran identity became much more central after I left the military, moving up to New England in my first year out. Now I live back in North Carolina. I live in a community where military affiliation is more common, or perhaps it's probably better to say more visibly common. And I actually feel like it's shifted further away from the center of my identity. So when we talk about mental health needs for veterans, I think what we're talking about, and what I propose in the chapter, is that we're meeting the mental health needs of students who also have a veteran identity, and that word veteran comes with this weight. Before you enter the military, you're a civilian. And then you're in the military and you're a soldier, airman, marine, guardian, sailor, coastie. There's this identity placed on you, which of course is this double-edged sword in itself. And then when you get out, do you go back to being a civilian? Kind of, but now you have this term veteran. And the term veteran is unifying for the community, but you're no longer in, but you're also no longer a civilian. So you're this veteran, which is this liminal space that I think can be a really difficult spot, especially as you adopt the identity of student. So what do we do to address this need? I look at it as these two buckets of what we can do in higher education. The first is clinical and the other is community. The first one, potentially the most obvious, is that our mental health clinics need to be able to support veterans, especially if they're recruiting student veterans or advertising being a veteran friendly for campus. There are higher rates of stigma in the military towards mental health than there are in the civilian population, and that stigma is decreasing. But I fear that we enhance that stigma if a veteran goes to a campus mental health clinic and states, here's what I have going on, and the clinic responds with, we don't really have anybody here who treats complex PTSD. Or we don't have anybody here who understands your specific experience. Or on the other side, when they identify themselves as a veteran, the clinic immediately assumes that what they're treating is going to be PTSD. Or the response I hear a lot of campus mental health clinics saying, we can start here, but is there a reason you're not going to the vet center or the VA? Responses like that can be very alienating for our students. And so especially if we call our school military friendly, which is a whole term to unpack, I think we need to make sure that we're equipped to at least have that first conversation, if not the full treatment. Because one of the things I heard time and time again as an embedded behavioral health officer was, I'm a little too nervous that I'm too different or too broken or too damaged to reassimilate into this normal life again. And I think if they go into a clinic and the clinic says, this might be too complicated for our clinic, we're affirming that core belief, that automatic thought. So what I like to say is nail that first conversation. The other thing clinically is the assessment tools. These are screening tools for mental health diagnoses. We heard in today's webinar about the PHQ-2 or the GAD-2. There are assessment tools that have been translated for the use of the military. There's a test called the PCL, which is an assessment tool for PTSD. They've actually developed a PCL-C, civilian, and PCL-M, military. Similar, even in triage and intakes, if you're on a campus with a high veteran population, it may be worth noting in your intake that it might need to be translated for our veteran community. And I don't mean translated in the sense that veterans don't understand it. I mean translated in the sense that we want to have this inclusive treatment. So a question like, have you ever thought about causing harm to others? We're putting a veteran in a position where they immediately have this moment where they're trying to back translate their experience, where they're like, well, I have thought about it because that's what I was trained to do, or I've been put in this position where I had to. But I also know that if I write that, I might set off these alarms. Will they know that this was just a military experience? So questions like that, there's just a few details on the clinical side. Now, the other side of what we could do is as a campus community outside of the clinics. And I think this is about a theme that I've heard through today, which is belonging. and mattering, and ensuring that veterans know that they do belong on this campus and that the veteran identity doesn't have to be this great differentiator. For me, this is identifying veterans' strengths and then helping them translate those to the campus community. So I've read, probably at this point, innumerable studies, but one of my favorites, it's a relatively small study by Sullivan and Yoon, published in 2020, which was a key year for studies on belonging and loneliness. And they identified veterans' perceived strengths. Now, notably, in comparison, if you were to read studies on veterans' perceived obstacles, you can actually see that they're almost one and the same. So, for example, one of the strengths that veterans identified was their ability to communicate across cultures and across diverse groups of people. Then, one of their obstacles from other studies is that they believe that their form of communication actually alienates them from the rest of the campus and their peers. So at once, veterans believe they are great communicators across difference, but also struggle to communicate across difference. Another quick example is that in the military, a sense of belonging relies on their sense of belonging in their squad size or platoon size element. So let's call that between 5 and 20 people. Studies say veterans yearn for that platoon sized accountability once they exit the military. Yet other studies find that veterans do not necessarily want to associate with their residential hall community, which provides that 5 to 20 sense of group and belonging that they yearn for. I did my own very small study a few years ago, seeing if we could translate residential life best practices to barracks best practices to increase belonging. And of the many things we found out of the study, notably soldiers did not identify their barracks hallway as a community they were a part of. They identified their squad, their platoon, their friend group, their company, their battalion, but where they lived and the people who lived next to them was not a community for them. In fact, many of them did not know who lived next to them. And so when we asked, how would you feel about building that community, and said, here's some res life strategies, even as basic as we could make signs for your door with your name on them, the overwhelming reaction was, please don't advertise where I live to the rest of my hall. These challenges and overcoming them, I think, relies on using a strength-based approach, understanding that there may be some translation, and that these things are true for some, but not all veterans. And ultimately, if there's one takeaway from my chapter, it's that student veterans are this incredibly diverse group of people, and that each campus is incredibly distinct. So meeting the mental health needs of student veterans takes not only having this baseline of cultural knowledge, but also taking the time to do assessments of your own campus. And if you don't have a military or veteran mental health expert on your clinical staff or res life staff or student affairs staff, I highly recommend tapping into these great organizations or individual consultants that can be advisors for your campus on the small changes. Because as a whole, I believe so strongly that student veterans can be really powerful contributors to a campus community with these really unique experiences, and ultimately this heart towards service of their community, which can be your campus. And I'll end my remarks there for today.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Next, we'll go to Adrian to talk about some of the campus-based implications from beautiful San Diego.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for being here. Yes, we are in beautiful San Diego today. It is, I believe, about 75 degrees, so you're all welcome to come visit us. As I was listening to our colleagues here, one of the things that was resonating in my head is, how do you take what you've read in a book or seen in a research study and then make it practical on your campus? And I think the reality is that all of our campuses are very diverse. All of our students are very diverse. They have multiple identities. And so what we did here at Miramar, I'm the Vice President of Student Services at San Diego Miramar. And we're a 2-year community college, serve about 15,000 students currently. And we serve everybody from students in high school who are high achievers who are trying to take early college credit to 80-year-old retirees who are just looking for lifelong learning, everybody in between. So how do you identify what their needs are from a mental health perspective? How do you identify what their needs are from a basic needs perspective? And as we were coming out of COVID, I think the realization we had was that we had to create communities of environments to allow people to be seen. And we came up with the theme of making the invisible visible. And we really started to talk about, how do we collaborate more effectively to engage students with the campus. And that then allowed us to tie in collaborations between mental health and special programs, financial aid, the Basic Needs Center, and we created what we called a college hour, where it was in the middle of the day where we didn't schedule classes. And we started to put a lot of activity into that college hour. And we really tried to destigmatize this idea that you're in need of some sort of resource, whether it be mental health or basic needs or anything else. And you have to come to this office and you have to talk to this individual in order to get those resources. And instead, we brought it out into the open and said, hey, this is available to anybody. This is an opportunity to interact with others who are going through the same thing. And these things kind of cross connect. When you are in school, you may run into some basic need struggles, let's say with food. Yeah, you're going to have a student and right next to you is probably thinking the same thing. How do I afford my next meal? And so by bringing that out into the open and saying, hey, we have this great food pantry that has free food for everybody. Just pop over even if you want a snack. It makes it less intimidating. You don't have to be the only one that's there. I mentioned our college hour. One of the things that we started to recognize is that we had campus resource fairs. We did it, a couple times a semester to let people know what's available. We had a career fair. We had a transfer fair. We had Club Rush. And typically each of those areas was doing it separately. And then we started to say, wait a minute, why don't we have mental health go out and put up a table, put up a pop-up tent while we're doing these different events? It doesn't just have to be during the resource fair. It could also be during Club Rush. It could also be during transfer fair, which led to financial aid office being out there and the counseling center being out there, because we had a captive audience for a period of time. And so keep reinforcing the idea that, hey, there are these resources available to you. We'll come to you if you don't want to come to us. We're here. And then we would do kind of these treasure hunts. It's like you could go get a free pizza by visiting a certain number of tables, right? And so students were quick to pick up on that and say, yeah, I want a free pizza. Let me go ahead and do this. Free giveaways, t-shirts, things like that. And then we started tying some kind of hard tools that we knew we needed. So we purchased a couple of apps that were available to students 24/7 for mental health, as well as for medical health. We started to do data surveys to really hear from our students, really what they're struggling with. The survey that we did was interesting in that it linked also what was going on in San Diego County. So we were able to see how our students were being impacted and did it match up with what the county was seeing. And oftentimes it did, but of course there were certain unique things to college students that we were able to kind of then address. So I think for us, a lot of it was a work in progress. This wasn't a one-time event that we did. It wasn't a one-time strategy that we utilized. It was really building over time a series of approaches and techniques and including tools that allowed us to then respond uniquely to each individual student. And this morning, it was funny, I was going through my email and I saw 3 events that stood out to me in relation to this workshop. The Black Student Resource Center today is doing a restorative wellness workshop. And it's interesting because I know that they're tying in the cultural aspect of what we're trying to do with our Black students, along with the mental health aspect of, hey, let's help you refresh because we just came off of spring break and we're getting ready for finals. So let's make sure you have the energy to enter finals. Also today is Pause on Campus. What we do periodically is we bring dogs on campus to really just let students kind of hang out and have some fun. But of course, there's a mental health wellness aspect to that. And then later this afternoon, we're having a tailgate party for our volleyball team. It's one of their rival games that they're having. And so our equity center partnered with the athletic department to invite the entire campus out for a tailgate party before the volleyball game. And again, it's a sense of community. It's a sense of, hey, you belong here. You're part of us. Take advantage of what's available to you, and get to know who we are. I think a lot of times we all know that students view us as like these um, unapproachable instructors, administrators, staff members. And then when they finally sit down and talk with us, they really realize, hey, we're human beings too. And we like to have fun too, and we like to engage as well. And so I think that really has been our strategy on campus, is to really create these environments where people feel like they belong. And there's multiple environments. If you had looked at us 10 years ago, that's not who we were. We had offices that people could go to. Now it's really about us creating as many environments as possible for people to find their identity and to feel like they belong on campus. I'll end with that, as people may have some questions.
I love that. No, I think that is a perfect note to end on in terms of kind of how a campus and, really the physical location of an institution can evolve to meet learners. And I think, as we think about what does the future of education look like as we see really rapid shifts in the world, that part remains a really core component of what a physical campus provides. And I love that framing. We do have about 15 minutes here for questions. And so please feel free to use either the primary chat or the Q&A chat here. And I will take those and elevate those. You can also send those to me or Andrea directly. This one, Adrian, maybe from a campus perspective, but also from any of the authors as well. How do you motivate students to show up to events and opportunities to build a sense of belonging? And, to editorialize a little bit, we're trying to build these communities and sense of belonging, but there are these barriers to the engagement components. So whether that's a specific population, Adam or Rainesford, from the work that you've done, with students, I think any of you have great perspectives on that. So maybe Adrian, start with you and can go from there.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know that was something we struggled with earlier. One of the things that we recognize is that when a singular department did their workshop, they might get 2, 5, 6 students to show up. So then we started talking about, okay, how do we collaborate to make this worth our time and effort, right? And so the veterans program, recognizing that they had students from the EOPS program that were veterans. They also had students from this disabled students program that were veterans. So I said, hey, have you guys thought about collaborating together and maybe doing a workshop for all 3 of your programs? And then include mental health in that, because we're coming out of COVID and people are struggling with, all sorts of things right now. And then, oh, by the way, include the Basic Needs Center, because they might have resources that they can access through the Basic Needs Center. And so as we got more comfortable with, hey, we don't have to do it by ourselves, let's do it as a team, students started to then see, oh, I recognize that person from this other program. Oh, I have heard about this before. Maybe I can learn more about this. And so I think it was, again, a work in progress. It wasn't like overnight, but we really started to think about the multiple identities that a student had and try to bring those departments together to then approach things, in a unified way. And then we started seeing more students showing up for these workshops. So the latest one that ran yesterday, I think they had like 20 students that showed up. And so for those of you who work on college campuses, when you see 20 students show up for a workshop, you're like, hey. So it's been a work in progress, but I think largely giving them a sense of community by bringing multiple identities together.
Adam, you have something here?
Yeah, I just think I'll be so quick on it. I just think of the centrality of the student in the creation process for these opportunities as well. So I always think about the idea of beneficiary-centered design, that if the students build something, they have ownership over it, you really tap into their network. And there's almost no better way to make sure it's a good event for students if you have students at the table. There's a mentor of mine who they had a problem on campus where the culture became that there was one building where all of the parties were happening. And that just became the note. And this wasn't a building you opted to live in. It was just randomly assigned to a fifth of the campus. Yet, year after year, that became the party building until this one dean said, we're going to just ask students who are artists who live in the building to paint murals on each of the walls. And suddenly, the respect for the building grew because it was a building that was not of the university, it was of the students, and there was that art. So while you might party in a university building, you sure weren't going to party on the hall that had this beautiful artwork done by somebody you're in class with. And I like that example of just changing the culture by increasing student ownership.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah. We have a lot of great questions that have come in. So we'll provide them. And if you have something, please feel free to jump in. But I might default to Alexis on this one, unless somebody else has something. Do you find that graduate students are in a different category as it relates to their mental health needs?
But I love this question being in space with two of my former graduate students. Both Bryan and Adam are former students of mine. And so it's an extra bit of joy. Also, Rainesford and Adrian are frequent guest speakers in my graduate level courses. I used to think that, actually. I used to think that we were having two very different kinds of conversations. And as per usual, the students taught me better. So here's how I discovered that. In my graduate course with students who are training to be student affairs professionals, I taught this idea called the W curve, which is a visual representation of the very real sort of ups and downs of being in college. The moments of celebration, the honeymoon phase, culture shock, rebounding, this typical sort of pattern that we see. And I was teaching it to my graduate students so that they could use it with undergraduates to scaffold the way that they were doing programming. And what I discovered is my graduate students immediately adopted that for themselves. And they started having different kinds of conversations with me rather than coming into my office and beating around the bush about a thing that they were struggling with because they felt embarrassed by it, because they thought it was unique to them. Instead, they marched in and they were like, oh, I'm really, really stuck in this culture shock phase, or honeymoon phase was really short because they had a language for it. They could suddenly talk about it openly. And what I've realized in reflecting since then is all of the struggles that our undergraduates are having, our graduate students are having, but our graduate students are less likely to name and talk about them. And they're also carrying the baggage from whatever happened in their undergraduate experience into those conversations. And so if they were in a caring campus with warm policies where they felt supported, they'll expect that of us. And that's great because they show up in our offices. But if they were at an institution or multiple institutions with cold policies where they didn't feel that support, they're less likely to talk to us. They're more likely to assume that we are not there to help them. And so we have to do the hard work of scaffolding. Here's how we create a caring community here. Here's how we're showing up for you. Now show up with us and be in conversation.
Great. Thank you. Next one here is what role could cross-institutional learning cohorts play in helping institutions to better support both clinical and non-clinical mental health needs? And then along with that, Adrian, too, there's also a question about how do you get leadership buy-in? And so maybe thinking about, this whole cross-institutional component together could be a good one.
Yeah, so one of the things that we benefit from here in San Diego is San Diego Miramar is part of a 4-college district, and so we have regular meetings across the district. But then San Diego region, we actually have meetings among the VPs once a month, and there's 10 community colleges in our region plus I think 4 4-year schools as well. So we meet with them as well. So we regularly have conversations. It ranges from everything from like mental health to just, matriculation practices and things like that. And I think one of the things that has to happen is just kind of some honesty about what our students are experiencing, because it happens at all our institutions. And I think we had to let down our guard in terms of competition, right? So there's enough students to go around, so we're not constantly having to hey, those are my students, those are your students. And I think in a region like San Diego, as an example, students go to our different institutions as they need to. So they might enroll with San Diego District for a couple of semesters, and then for other reasons, maybe they moved into another area, they're going to now Palomar College or Southwestern College. And so it really does not behoove us to be in competition, but really to be in partnership. So what I would encourage people to do is to really open those conversations, right? Reach out to your colleagues at other institutions and really just start to have a conversation. The other piece of this is, how do you support this? How do you convince your leadership that this is important, right? Some of that is with data, collect as much data as you can and put it in front of your leadership and say, hey, look, we're seeing this trend. We need to try and address this. But I think the other piece of it too is that have a meaningful discussion with your leadership, right? Bring multiple people together. So not just one person come up with this idea, but really collectively come together with your leadership and have a good conversation about the directions you're thinking about going. I've shared with Alexis in her class multiple times that my dean of student affairs, we've been working collaboratively to develop our food pantry and our wellness center over a period of 8 years. And every time she comes to with an idea, my initial reaction is like, oh, how am I going to pay for that? We don't have the staffing, blah, blah, blah. Typical VP thing, right? But as we discuss, okay, what can we do, right? It doesn't have to be perfect yet. It doesn't have to be the whole picture yet. What can we do? So I would encourage folks that are at lower level leadership to really give the opportunity to that upper level leadership to say, here's what we maybe can pull off right now. I'm not asking for the world, but can I have this piece? And the same thing for those of you who are senior leaders, be open to those conversations, right? Don't shut it all down because you don't have the money or the time or the resources, because inevitably you probably could do one or two things to keep the momentum going. So that would be my advice.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more here, so I'll open this up, and I think it's a really good one to maybe end on because it's a part of kind of the broader conversation. Can you all discuss how much loneliness contributes to student mental health? And so, Allyson, I know we have some data. Rainesford, you've talked to students, and anybody else, more than happy to. I will send out the other questions that we've received to the panelists. If anybody has thoughts on them, we can respond back in writing after. But I'll kind of close with this one.
Yeah, I can answer and then see if anyone else wants to jump in. But we see, loneliness in our student financial wellness survey and our other student-facing work. We see that loneliness is strongly associated with depression and anxiety, even beyond financial stress alone. Students who feel isolated are much more likely to have a positive screen for one of those mental health concerns, especially when that loneliness is overlapping with financial hardship or basic needs and security. And this kind of makes sense, right? I always like to center a critical part of this relationship for lonely students, which is the absence of a strong social support network. Students who feel lonely might lack those trusted peers, family members or mentors to kind of talk about their challenges with or to turn to when they need help. And this in turn can make them less likely to seek assistance, whether that's reaching out for emotional support, connecting with available campus resources, or just asking for help before a problem escalates. And this can kind of all amplify stress and create a cycle in which those mental health challenges, that feeling of social isolation, and those unmet basic needs can reinforce one another with really real consequences for these students for their academic engagement and persistence.
I'll just say very quickly, if I can, that one of the things that's come up anecdotally over the course of conversations that I've had with students really of all ages is this shame that's associated with loneliness. For a lot of people, it feels so counterintuitive to what the college experience is supposed to be. And we know it might not be that way for all kinds of different reasons, but I still think that it can be really disorienting when you've idealized this chapter of your life, whatever it might look like, and find yourself feeling lonely or sort of disenchanted and feeling like you are the only one experiencing that. So the students that I've spoken to over the course of the last couple of years in particular have talked about how important it is to have conversations that aren't just naming things like stress or anxiety, but are also explicitly naming loneliness. I think when we talk about that, it kind of strips back that layer of shame or that idea that you might be the only one experiencing that sensation. So I think that that's what I would say, that talking about it and naming it is something that's come through in multiple conversations with students as being really important.
Absolutely. I want to plus one on that. In the research that we do, again, over 80 years, what we have seen again and again is that it is typical for college students to feel lonely and graduate students to feel lonely as you are navigating this really hard thing. But what is also typical is they all think they are alone in feeling lonely. So when I spend time on different college campuses around the country, I will often interview people who are in friend groups, but they don't know what the other person said because they're one-on-one interviews. And each one will tell me, I feel so lonely. My roommate has it all figured out. All of my classmates are thriving. I'm the only one who's having a hard time. And so when we can change the conversation on our campus, that loneliness is part of this process. Developmentally, it's part of the process. Realistically, pragmatically, as we're navigating, it's just what it feels like to be doing a new thing at a new moment and embracing this new chapter. Then they know they're not alone in that feeling. And they might still feel lonely, but they won't be alone in that feeling. And there's something really profound in doing that.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. And that was a perfect, I think, kind of question to close our conversation here. I just want to encourage everybody to check out the book. These were a couple chapters in Adrian's work that was highlighted here today, but there is so much more that is in the volume. And again, we will post that in the chat again and send it out in the follow-up after. But please join me in thanking our panelists here today for a great conversation. If you are in Texas or want to come to Texas, we will also be continuing this conversation in May in Austin. And so looking forward to that as well. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to our amazing panelists for sharing their expertise. And I hope that everybody gets a chance to add the book to their spring and summer reading list here over the next few months. So thank you all.